You are standing at the edge of an empire. The air is dry, the horizon shimmering with heat, and somewhere ahead of you lies a line of packed earth that stretches farther than your eyes can follow. It is not just a road, but the royal road of Persia, the lifeline that bound together a dominion so vast that its frontiers touched the Aegean Sea in the west and brushed against the edges of India in the east. If you had lived in those times, you would have known the road not as a place for wandering travelers, but as a channel through which the kings will flowed. The royal road was no marketplace lane, no local path worn by shepherds and their flocks. It was a deliberate construction of empire, a corridor designed for speed, for endurance, and above all for control. The Persian kings, beginning with Cyrus the Great and perfected under Darius I, understood something that few rulers before them had grasped so fully. An empire is only as strong as its communication. To rule millions across thousands of miles, to collect taxes from cities you would never visit, to quell rebellions before they flamed into wars. All this depended on words moving faster than the feet of ordinary men could carry them. And so, the riders of the royal road came into being. Imagine a courier setting out from Susa, the royal capital in the heart of Persia. He does not carry bags of trade goods or tools of war. Instead, he holds a small bundle, perhaps a tablet sealed with wax, its surface impressed with cuneiform script. It may contain a royal decree, the reassignment of a satrap, or a command for new levies of soldiers. It may contain the smallest detail of governance, a change in taxation, a report of banditry. But in this empire, even the small details mattered. The rider mounts a horse bred not for battle, but for endurance. His journey will not be a single dash across the empire, but a relay, every few miles along the royal road. Stations known as peridots await him. At each station, a fresh horse is ready, rested, watered, and prepared to continue. The courier dismounts, hands over his document, mounts again, and is gone in a cloud of dust. What is remarkable is not the journey of one man, but the system that sustained him. Behind the courier's speed lay a quiet infrastructure. Stable boys, overseers, scribes who recorded the passing of each message, and guards who ensured the safety of the road. Herodotus, the Greek historian who traveled among the Persians, marveled at the system. He wrote that neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor darkness of night prevents these couriers from completing their appointed course with the utmost speed. Long before the phrase was adopted as a motto of a modern postal service, it described the discipline of men whose names we do not know, but whose endurance held the empire together. For you, listening now, the royal road might sound like a dull strip of packed earth, but think of what it represented. At its full extent, the road ran nearly 1,700 miles, from Sardis, near the Aegean coast of modern Turkey, all the way to Susa in the Iranian plateau. To travel it on foot might take 3 months. By relay of mounted couriers, messages could cross it in just 7 days. 7 days to carry the king's word across an empire that stretched wider than the reach of any ruler before him. The couriers themselves lived lives of anonymity. We do not know their faces or their names, but we know the rhythm of their duties. At dawn, a horse prepared. At midday, another exchanged. At night, perhaps a pause, though some relays pressed forward even under the light of torches. Their burden was rarely heavy. A tablet, a seal, a pouch of letters. The weight lay not in the object, but in the authority it carried. It is tempting to imagine the glory of conquest, the battles and the palaces of kings. But history often hides its endurance in the boring details. What allowed Persia to hold together so many lands was not only its armies, but its couriers. Each anonymous rider was a thread, and together they wove the empire into a single garment. Consider, too, the perspective of those who lived along the road but were not part of it. To a farmer, the royal road might have been both a marvel and an irritation. Its presence brought guards, travelers, and occasional inspection. It also brought obligations. Horses must be fed, inns must be maintained. The empire's demand for speed meant that local labor sustained the stations. To live by the road was to live partly in service to it. And yet, there was a kind of safety in its presence. Bandits who once haunted lonely paths now faced soldiers assigned to protect the couriers. Towns along the road became stops, their economies tied to the passing riders. A single sealed tablet could bring soldiers to suppress rebellion, merchants to settle disputes, or tax collectors to remind a city of its obligations. The road was not only for messages, but for the presence of empire itself. Pause for a moment and imagine the sheer physicality of it. The pounding of hooves, the dust rising in the sun, the moment when one courier dismounted, his chest heaving, sweat streaking his tunic, only to see another mount spring forward with his burden. A relay not of words, but flesh, sweat, and speed. And beyond that dust, in palaces far away, kings who never saw these men trusted them utterly. The riders became extensions of royal will, their very bodies tools of governance. They did not speak for themselves, but carried the voices of others, voices that decided the lives of thousands. You may ask, why does this matter now? After all, empires rise and fall and roads crumble. But if you look closely, you will see the shadow of Persia's couriers and the systems you rely on today. Every time a message flashes across your screen in seconds, every time a government issues an order that reaches the farthest edge of its territory, you're living in the echo of those riders. The royal road may have been a packed earth, but it laid the foundation for the very idea of fast, reliable communication across a state. And yet, the story is not finished, because the speed of communication was not always an advantage. What happens when messages arrive too quickly? When news of rebellion, assassination, or defeat travels faster than armies can march? This is where the story of the royal road becomes complicated. The very system that gave the Persian kings such control also created new vulnerabilities. The road was more than dust and hoofbeats. It was the nervous system of an empire. Every courier who leapt onto a fresh horse at a roadside station was not simply relaying a message. He was transmitting a spark of authority from the imperial brain at Susa or Persepolis to the farthest limbs of Asia Minor. To understand the Persian Empire, you must understand the speed. It was not simply about carrying words, but about creating the illusion that the king was everywhere at once. Imagine being a satrap, a governor appointed to oversee one of the empire's vast provinces. You sit in Sardis, more than 1,000 miles away from the great king's palace. Yet one morning, a courier arrives with a sealed command bearing the royal mark. It dictates a change in tax collection, a demand for soldiers, or perhaps a personal reprimand for your delay in forwarding revenues. The distance is immense, but the message feels immediate. You cannot pretend the king does not see you. The royal road annihilates distance, and with it, excuses. This is why the couriers mattered so much. They created the impression that no one, no matter how far away, was beyond the king's notice. The road itself was an invisible leash. In war, speed meant life or death. When rebellion stirred in Egypt or unrest spread in Babylon, the difference between suppression and collapse often came down to how quickly orders moved. A courier racing across Anatolia might carry news that Greek mercenaries had stirred trouble, or that Scythian raiders had broken across the frontier. Without the road, such news might arrive too late for the king to act. With the road, orders for reinforcements could be dispatched in days. Herodotus, who marveled at the Persian system, compared it to nothing else he knew in Greece. The Greeks had city-states, close-knit and often quarrelsome, where messages could be shouted across a marketplace. But Persia ruled continents. For them, communication had to conquer space itself. It is easy to imagine the couriers as heroic figures, but the true story is less glamorous, more mundane, and perhaps more interesting. At every Pyridatsa station along the royal road, there were men and women whose names history has forgotten. Stable hands who fed and watered the horses. Local villagers who provided grain and hay. Scribes who marked the passage of each courier, noting the seal on his document and the hour of his arrival. To maintain such a system required not only horses and men, but an endless supply of labor. Grain had to be hauled, fodder stored, saddles repaired, roads kept smooth and clear. It is one thing to say that a courier could travel 1,700 miles in 7 days. It is another to imagine the silent army of workers who made that miracle possible. Their contribution is rarely acknowledged, but without them, the riders would have been helpless. This was the essence of Persian rule. Great achievements built upon the small, often invisible labors of ordinary people. Yet, for all its strength, The system carried hidden dangers. Speed gave power, but speed also brought fragility. A single false report could spread just as quickly as a truth. If a courier carried the wrong message, by mistake, by forgery, or by treachery, it could set armies in motion against shadows. There are tales, though fragmentary, of counterfeiters who tried to mimic the royal seal. A forged tablet, carried along the same trusted road, could become a weapon. Imagine a governor receiving an order to march his soldiers east, leaving his province undefended, only to learn later that the order was a lie. The very efficiency of the royal road made such deceit especially dangerous. And there was another risk. By centralizing communication, the system also centralized dependency. If the royal road was blocked, by flood, by invasion, by rebellion, the empire's lifeline snapped. The king, so accustomed to quick reports, could be blinded overnight. Step for a moment into the shoes of someone who lived by the road. You are an innkeeper's son near Arbela. For you, the arrival of a courier is both routine and extraordinary. You see dust on the horizon, a rider bent low over his horse, the animal's flanks dark with sweat. He halts only long enough to shout, to dismount, to seize the reins of a fresh horse. He drinks a handful of water, and then he is gone again, a blur disappearing into the east. You hardly speak to him, but you feel his presence like a gust of wind, sudden, urgent, and fleeting. Your family feeds the next horse, sweeps the dust, prepares again for the next rider. It is your life's rhythm, dictated by men who never pause long enough to know your name. And yet, there is a kind of quiet pride in this routine. You know that your small task, invisible to history, keeps the empire alive. When Greek envoys and travelers witnessed the Persian system, they were struck not only by its efficiency, but by its strangeness. In their world, messages were slow, uncertain, subject to the whims of wind and sea. To see orders fly across mountains and deserts in days must have seemed almost unnatural. It is no accident that later empires, Rome above all, borrowed heavily from Persia's model. The Roman cursus publicus, its state postal system, echoed the Persian relay of horses and stations. The idea that a ruler's command should outpace rebellion, that word should ride faster than armies, was one of Persia's quiet legacies. But here's the part most often overlooked. Every mile gained in speed demanded a price. Horses collapsed from exhaustion, replaced without ceremony. Couriers risked their lives against storms, robbers, and disease. Families along the route labored endlessly to provide supplies. In the grand sweep of history, these details seem dull, yet they're the details that matter. Without the constant sacrifice of animals and people, the illusion of omnipresent kingship would have collapsed. The road was not paved with glory. It was paved with the sweat of the unseen. For Persians themselves, the road was more than a utility. It was a symbol of order. In the king's inscriptions, the empire was portrayed as a vast but unified whole, held together by divine favor and human loyalty. The royal road embodied that unity. To ride it was to experience the empire's scale. To send messages along it was to affirm that the king's voice carried everywhere. It was, in a sense, a performance of power. And yet, every performance has its weaknesses. By the later reigns, as Persia strained under external pressures, the very reliance on swift couriers revealed the empire's dependence. Enemies learned to disrupt the routes, to attack stations, to sow false information. The system that once allowed the king to act decisively now became a weakness. A single disruption could spread confusion faster than ever before. It is a paradox worth pausing on. The same speed that once made Persia strong could, under different conditions, make it brittle. And so we arrive at an unresolved question. If the strength of an empire lies in its communication, what happens when communication itself becomes a weapon that undermines it? The royal road, for all its dust and discipline, was not eternal. Like the empire it served, it reached its height and then slowly, almost imperceptibly, began to wane. To trace its decline is to see how even the strongest threads can fray when the world changes around them. By the later Achaemenid rulers, the machinery of the postal system was still functioning, but cracks had begun to show. Resources that once flowed steadily into maintaining the road became strained. Wars on multiple fronts, ambitious building projects, and court intrigues sapped both money and attention. A station that had once been stocked with fresh horses now struggled to keep even a few tired animals. Inns fell into disrepair. Guards who once patrolled with vigilance now turned lax, or worse, turned to petty extortion of those who depended on the road. The couriers still rode, but the system no longer hummed with the same flawless rhythm. The decisive break came with the arrival of Alexander of Macedon, when his army swept into Persia in the 4th century BCE. They not only shattered military resistance, but also disrupted the delicate web of communication. Alexander himself recognized the genius of the Persian network. He ordered his officers to seize and adapt the roads, using them to carry his own commands. The royal road became, for a time, a tool of conquest rather than control. It is one of history's quiet ironies that the same system designed to protect the empire was turned into an instrument of its undoing. Yet, decline did not mean disappearance. The idea of the royal road, the concept of the state-run communication network, survived long after Persian banners were torn down. The Romans, in particular, adopted and expanded the model. Their cursus publicus resembled the Persian system almost point for point. Relay stations, fresh horses, riders bearing official documents sealed with authority. The Romans gave it their own stamp, integrating it into their military and administrative machine. But the seed was Persian. Even centuries later, the Byzantines, the Abbasids, and medieval empires echoed the same pattern. Whenever a ruler needed to project power across distance, the thought returned: build a road, relay messages, bind the land with speed. The Persian couriers may have vanished, but their hoofbeats resounded through time. As we look back, it is tempting to focus only on kings and empires, but pause for a moment to consider the ordinary couriers themselves. Men whose faces are lost to history, yet who bore the burden of imperial will on their backs. They lived lives of exhaustion and urgency, riding through storms, over rivers, across deserts. Some surely perished on the road, their names never recorded. Others may have returned home after years of service, bearing nothing more than the memory of endless dust and galloping hooves. It is in these forgotten lives that the road becomes human. The empire was held together not only by decrees and soldiers, but by the unrelenting labor of men who rarely paused, who carried words that were not their own. What remains striking is how the royal road was not only a physical path, but a metaphor for empire itself. Strong when maintained, fragile when neglected, swift in its purpose, yet vulnerable to deception. It reflected the paradox of governance. The stronger the connections, the more catastrophic their failure could become. Every empire since has wrestled with the same truth. From Roman roads to telegraph wires, from postal services to the internet, each age has its own royal road. Each seeks to conquer distance, to compress time, to make authority present everywhere. And each inherits the same risks. Speed empowers, but speed also exposes. If you strip away the details of saddles and horses, what you see in Persia's system is the birth of an idea we still live within. That power is not only about armies or wealth, but about communication. The next time you receive a message in seconds from across the world, remember that once men on sweating horses rode day and night to achieve the same miracle. They stitched together an empire of stone and dust, so that one man's words could rule millions. It is not the battles we should remember most, but the couriers who made rule itself possible. The royal road no longer exists in its ancient form. Parts of it lie buried beneath modern highways, fragments swallowed by towns and fields. But in its time, it was as revolutionary as any invention of steel or silicon. It taught rulers that distance could be conquered, that words could carry power faster than swords. It taught subjects that the king's presence was not limited to his palace, but could arrive unexpectedly at their very doorstep. And it taught history one of its most enduring lessons, that the most boring details, roads, couriers, stations, often shaped destiny more than crowns and battles ever could. So the story of the riders ends not with a single event, but with a quiet legacy, a road fading into dust, yet echoing in every system of communication since. And you are left with a thought to carry forward. If empires are remembered for their conquests, why is it so often their roads, their couriers, and their silent systems that outlive them? Long before the rustle of parchment or the crackle of paper, messages in the Persian Empire were carried on surfaces that to us would feel heavy, awkward, and strangely fragile. These were the clay tablets, coated with wax, pressed with styluses, and bound by seals that bore the weight of authority. To hold one was to hold a fragment of empire, small and simple in appearance, yet immense in consequence. Imagine the courier, not with a folded letter, but with a tablet no larger than a hand. Its surface glistened faintly with beeswax, the characters impressed in neat rows. Along one edge, a seal pressed by the king's own signet or by the cylinder stamp of satrap marked it as genuine. It was both a message and a lock, a voice preserved in clay and wax, safe against the risks of distance. Today, paper seems natural, almost invisible. But in the 5th century BCE, paper was not yet known in Persia. Papyrus existed, of course, brought from Egypt, but it was costly and limited. For official communication, Persia relied on what was at hand: clay and wax. Clay was plentiful, cheap, and durable. The Mesopotamians had used it for centuries, baking their words into permanence. But clay was also cumbersome. A single tablet could weigh as much as a small brick. To carry many was to burden a courier with more than messages. It was to load him down like a trader with stone. Wax, by contrast, offered a different possibility. By coating a wooden or clay surface with beeswax, one can inscribe letters more lightly, erase them by smoothing, and reuse the surface. Wax was fragile, yes, but it was also adaptable. And when sealed with an impression, it became secure. This was a technology of communication in an empire that stretched across mountains and deserts, not flimsy sheets of paper, but solid, weighty objects that bore the pressure of styluses and seals. Picture the scribe at work. He sits in a dim chamber, perhaps in Persepolis, perhaps in Sardis. Before him is a prepared tablet, its surface coated in dark wax. He holds a stylus, not a pen, but a pointed tool of metal or bone. With slow, careful strokes, he presses lines and wedges into the wax, forming words in Aramaic, the lingua franca of the empire. Why Aramaic? Because it was a language that most officials and merchants could understand. Though Persian kings spoke Old Persian, their empire was a mosaic of tongues. Aramaic, already spread through Mesopotamia, became the bridge. When the scribe finishes, he does not fold or roll the tablet. Instead, he applies a seal. Perhaps it is a cylinder seal, rolled across the surface to leave a continuous impression of lions or gods. Perhaps it is a signet ring, pressed to leave the mark of a satrap. Whatever the form, the seal declares authenticity. To break it without permission is treason. The seal was not decoration. It was the very heart of the message's authority. In a world where most subjects could not read, the image of the seal was more powerful than the words themselves. To see the king's mark was to know that the message carried his voice. It was a guarantee, a shield against doubt. But seals also carried danger. If forged, they could turn truth into deception. Stories linger of counterfeit seals used to manipulate governors, though such tales are often fragmentary, half-whispered in the margins of history. Still, the risk was real. A small impression in wax could alter the course of armies. Now, picture the courier. He receives a tablet, sealed and bound. To protect it, it may be wrapped in cloth or carried in a small wooden case. He tucks it into a pouch at his side. As he gallops along the royal road, the tablet rattles faintly. Each station he passes through records his arrival. Each horse he mounts carries the weight of empire, not in gold, not in weapons, but in a small wax-coated block that could change the fate of provinces. The fragility of the medium was always present. Wax could melt in heat, crack in cold, or smear under careless hands. Yet the Persians persisted, trusting in the discipline of their couriers and the resilience of their stations. You may wonder why the Persians bothered with such tablets at all. Why not simply rely on word of mouth, on messengers repeating the king's commands aloud? After all, many cultures before them had done just that. The answer lies in precision and permanence. Words spoken can be forgotten, altered, or denied. A courier might misremember, or worse, embellish. A wax-sealed tablet, though fragile, was unchanging. What the king wrote was what the satrap read. The seal prevented tampering. The wax preserved accuracy. It was In short, the difference between rumor and command. Behind every tablet lay a bureaucracy of staggering complexity. Scribes trained for years in languages and scripts. Officials determined which matters required writing, which could be spoken. Archivists stored copies in palaces, creating libraries of clay and wax that recorded taxes, disputes, and decrees. To us, such records might seem unbearably dull. Lists of grain collected, tallies of livestock, notes of payment to workers. Yet it is precisely in such dull records that we glimpse the machinery of empire. Without them, armies could not be fed, roads could not be maintained, and satraps could not be monitored. Boring, yes. Essential, absolutely. Think for a moment of the trust embedded in such a system. The king trusted the scribe to write accurately. The satrap trusted the seal to prove authenticity. The courier trusted his horse to carry him swiftly. And the empire trusted the entire chain, fragile as it was, to hold together. One broken link, a careless scribe, a corrupted courier, a forged seal, could unravel the illusion of control. And yet, most of the time, the system worked. The fact that we even speak of the Persian Empire's efficiency today is proof of its success. For you, listening now, there's a kind of intimacy in imagining these tablets. The next time you hold a book, a letter, or even a phone, pause to consider the weight of a wax-sealed message in a courier's pouch. It was not light, not disposable. It carried with the full authority of kings, the trust of empires, the labor of countless invisible hands. These tablets remind us that communication has always been physical, material, and costly. What seems effortless today once demanded sweat, beeswax, clay, and the pounding hooves of horses across desert roads. And so Section 1 leaves us here with a question. If words pressed into wax could bind together a world, what does it mean that today our words float as light across invisible air? Does their very ease make them stronger or weaker than the fragile weight of a wax-sealed tablet? If Section 1 showed you the weight of a single tablet, Section 2 brings you into rooms where those tablets multiplied into thousands. For the Persian Empire did not survive on couriers alone, but on the quiet diligence of scribes and archivists, men whose pens, or rather, styluses, shaped the empire's very memory. Imagine a scribe's chamber in Persepolis. The room is cool, its walls thick against the sun. Light filters through small openings, enough to illuminate rows of clay tablets stacked neatly, some sealed, others drying. At a low table sits the scribe, his hands practiced, his stylus steady. He writes in Aramaic, the chosen tongue of bureaucracy. It is not the king's native Persian, but a language broad enough to be understood from Egypt to Bactria. Every wedge he presses into wax is more than a word. It is a unit of governance, a fragment of power. Scribes were not mere recorders. They were interpreters, managers, and often gatekeepers. They decided how to phrase decrees, how to translate oral commands into written form, how to encode orders so that they could not easily be misunderstood. To serve as a scribe was to wield quiet influence. Few would ever know your name, yet your choices shaped how governors read the king's words. A misplaced sign, a poorly carved character, and an entire province might be taxed twice or receive soldiers it had not requested. Once a tablet left the scribe's hand, it might travel across the empire, but often a copy remained behind. In Persepolis, archaeologists have uncovered thousands of such records, the so-called Persepolis fortification tablets. What do these tablets contain? Not grand proclamations or stirring speeches, but lists, rations distributed to workers, tallies of livestock sent from provinces, records of grain collected for the satrapal stores, payments in wine, beer, or oil to those who served the court. To read them is, at first, to sink into monotony. They are repetitive, formulaic, and painfully detailed. Yet within this dullness lies the heartbeat of empire. Without such lists, the king's armies would starve, his palaces would fall into disrepair, his officials would withhold taxes. Boring, yes, but boredom was the scaffolding that held Persia upright. Each tablet bore a seal. In some cases, elaborate cylinder seals depicting animals, divine figures, or royal symbols. In others, simple impressions, personal to the official who carried responsibility. The seal was a signature in a world where signatures did not yet exist. To break it was to betray trust. To forge it was to strike at the empire's very core. Even ordinary transactions, a worker receiving barley, a courier claiming his ration of fodder, were sealed. This created a chain of accountability that stretched from the lowest labor to the throne itself. The wax was soft, the clay brittle, but the authority it conveyed was hard as iron. Think of a single decree. The king orders that Sardis must increase its levy of horses to supply the couriers. The command is dictated. The scribe inscribes it in Aramaic. The tablet is sealed. A copy remains in Persepolis. The courier carries the tablet westward. At each station, officials log his passage. At Sardis, the satrap receives the order, confirms the seal, and implements the levy. Local scribes record the delivery of horses, sealed again for proof. Couriers carry confirmation back east. This loop of writing, sealing, sending, and recording was the very rhythm of governance. Slow by our standards, but astonishingly fast for the ancient world. And every step was boring. Lists, seals, confirmations. Yet it was in these dull repetitions that the empire endured. Behind the grandeur king stood men with styluses and seals. Bureaucrats who never led armies or built palaces nonetheless ensured that armies marched and palaces stood. Their power was indirect, but immense. A scribe could delay a tablet, alter a phrase, or misapply a seal. Such acts might go unnoticed, or they might ripple outward into rebellion and famine. It is tempting to imagine history driven by great battles, but just as often, it was driven by clerical details, by a tablet arriving late, by a tally miscounted, by a seal applied incorrectly. Persia's bureaucracy was a double-edged sword, a marvel of order, but also a labyrinth where error and corruption could hide. Step for a moment into the archive itself. The smell of clay dust and beeswax lingers in the air. Rows of tablets line shelves, some wrapped in cloth for preservation. Young assistants move quietly, cataloging, stacking, fetching. You can almost hear the scratching of styluses, the murmured dictations, the thud of tablets set aside to dry. There is no glory here, no drama. Only the steady accumulation of records, day after day, year after year. Yet without this monotony, Persia would collapse into chaos. The empire's greatness was not only in its kings, but in its clerks. For all its order, the system was fragile. Wax melted in heat. Clay shattered if dropped. Seals could be broken. Archives could burn, as they did when Alexander's forces swept through Persepolis. In hours, years of records crumbled into ash. And yet, even in their destruction, these records tell us something. For the very fact that they were kept, copied, sealed, stored, shows how much Persia depended on them. Without archives, memory fades. Without memory, empires dissolve. For you, listening now, there's a lesson in this bureaucracy. Empires do not rest on kings alone, nor on warriors or monuments. They rest on clerks with styluses, on wax that carry seals, on archive that nobody visits until disaster strikes. It may feel boring to imagine rows of tablets, each with numbers of sheep or jars of oil. But these numbers fed soldiers, built roads, and sustained the couriers you met in Story 1. Without such boredom, there is no glory. And yet, where there is bureaucracy, there is always room for corruption. What if a scribe altered a number to favor a friend? What if an official withheld tablets to delay a tax order? What if a seal was applied not as proof, but as disguise? Such possibilities haunted every empire that relied on records. Persia was no exception. And as centuries passed, what once was the strength of the empire, its bureaucracy, could also become its weakness. If the empire's survival depended on scribes and seals, what happened when those scribes began to falter, and when seals became tools not of trust, but of manipulation? The wax-sealed tablet was a marvel of its age, but like all technologies, it was temporary. Its strength lay in its tangibility, in the weight of clay and wax, in the certainty of a seal pressed by hand. Its weakness lay in the very same things: fragility, heaviness, and dependence on human discipline. To follow the story of these tablets to its conclusion is to watch how empires rise on systems of order, and how those same systems can crack under their own weight. The Persian scribes who recorded grain deliveries and horse levies surely believed their records would endure. After all, a clay tablet, once fired, could last centuries. But wax was more delicate. A careless courier, a hot day, or a spilled jar of oil could erase lines forever. This fragility was tolerable in times of stability. But when invasions came, or when archives burned, the weakness of wax was laid bare. Alexander's conquest of Persia was not only a military catastrophe, but also an informational one. Fires consumed storehouses of tablets, turning decades of careful bureaucracy into dust. A courier could still carry a tablet, yes, but what good was a system when its archives were ash and its scribes scattered? Over time, other mediums began to displace wax and clay. Papyrus from Egypt and later parchment from animal skins offered new possibilities. Lighter, more flexible, easier to store. No longer would couriers rattle with the weight of small bricks. Instead, they carried folded sheets, bound with cords, sealed at the edges. Persia itself, in its later dynasties, began to adapt. The Parthians and Sassanids leaned more heavily on parchment. Rome, inheriting the Persian impulse for bureaucracy, made papyrus the backbone of its postal system. The wax tablet did not vanish overnight, but it slowly retreated into the role of a draft medium, a tool for temporary notes, not the empire's voice. Yet if the tablet faded, the seal endured. Even today, the very idea of authentication, the signature, the stamp, the watermark, carries echoes of Persia's wax-sealed decrees. The Romans adopted seals. The Byzantines refined them, and medieval kings pressed their signet rings into wax as proof of legitimacy. Even in the digital world, when you sign a message electronically, you are living the shadow of those ancient impressions. The Persians may have lost their empire, but the concept of sealing truth has outlived them. The wax-sealed tablet also offers a larger lesson. Bureaucracy is both salvation and vulnerability. In its prime, Persia's records ensure that taxes flowed, soldiers marched, and roads remained open. But bureaucracy has a way of hardening. Forms multiply, seals pile up, decisions slow. When scribes become corrupt, when seals lose trust, the very system meant to guarantee order begins to breed confusion. By the later Achaemenid period, whispers of inefficiency grew louder. Couriers still carried tablets, but their messages sometimes contradicted, delayed, or arrived too late. What had once been the empire's strength became one of its weaknesses. And behind it all lay the human labor we rarely name. The scribes who spent their lives hunched over styluses, carving lines into wax. The seal cutters who etched images into stone cylinders, never knowing their art would carry the voices of kings. The assistants who stacked and cataloged tablets, their hands dusty with clay. The couriers who bore the weight of fragile records, knowing that a single fall from a horse could destroy words meant for a satrap or a general. Their names are lost, their lives forgotten, but their labor shaped the machinery of empire. For you, listening now, there is something strangely humbling in these forgotten tablets. In their time, they were vital, guarded, sealed, carried with urgency. Today, they seem almost laughably fragile compared to the ease of a message on a glowing screen. And yet, ask yourself, does the ease of our communication make it more enduring or less? The Persians may have lost their empire, but fragments of their tablets still sit in museums. Their seals still legible after 2,500 years. Will our messages, floating as light across invisible networks, endure as long? The story of the wax-sealed tablet is not just Persian. It is the story of human communication itself. From clay to wax, from papyrus to parchment, from paper to digital signals, each step builds upon the last. What unites them is the same impulse: to preserve words across distance and time, to guarantee their authenticity, to carry authority where the speaker cannot go. In this sense, every text you send, every document you sign, is a descendant of those wax-coated blocks carried along the royal road. The Persians likely never imagined their wax-sealed tablets as boring history. To them, they were urgent, indispensable, and alive with consequence. To us, they seem dry and technical. Yet it is precisely in such boring details that civilizations are sustained. Wars are remembered, monuments admired. But it is the fragile seal in wax, pressed by an unseen hand, that often shapes the real destiny of nations. So the story ends where it began. with a courier galloping down a dusty road, carrying not treasure or weapons, but a small block of clay and wax. A fragile object, easily broken, and yet powerful enough to move armies, levy taxes, and command empires. And you are left with a question that lingers across centuries. If empires depend on the fragile tools of communication, how much of our own world rests on systems just as delicate, waiting for history to test their strength? If the royal road was the artery of the Persian Empire, then its rest stations were the pulse. Without them, the courier's speed would have been impossible. The stations, humble outposts scattered at intervals along the route, were the empire's first post offices, though no clerk behind a counter would have called them that. They were practical, unglamorous, and essential. In their simplicity lay the hidden machinery of empire. Picture a flat stretch of road in Anatolia. The sun is dropping, the horizon glowing red. Ahead, a low building of mud brick and timber stands by the roadside. This is a Pyridatsis, one of the many relay stations built by royal decree. The structure is plain: a courtyard for horses, a few rooms for resting, eating, or sleeping, storage spaces for grain and water, perhaps a small shrine where travelers could give thanks for safe passage. Around it, a scattering of workers' huts, where stable boys, grooms, and their families lived. There was no grandeur here, no gilded halls, no carved reliefs. Yet without these modest posts, the Persian courier system would collapse within days. The life of a station followed a simple, repetitive rhythm. A courier would arrive in a blur of dust, dismounting from his exhausted horse. Stable hands rushed forward, leading the animal away to water and feed. Another horse, already rested and saddled, stood waiting. The courier mounted without pause, perhaps grabbing a quick drink of water, and was gone again in minutes. Behind him, the station keeper recorded the exchange, the hour of arrival, the seal on the message, the identity of the rider. The exhausted horse was rubbed down, fed, and left to recover until it was needed again. It was a cycle that repeated endlessly, day and night, for as long as the empire endured. For the workers at these stations, life was monotonous but steady. A stable boy might spend his entire youth brushing horses, filling troughs, and carrying buckets of water. A cook's day might be little more than baking bread and preparing stews for the staff. Children grew up with the sound of hooves pounding the road, their games interrupted by the sudden arrival of riders. To them, the couriers were figures of awe, dusty, stern, always in a hurry. But their families knew the truth. Without the endless labor of nameless workers, the riders could not continue. These were forgotten Persians, whose lives were bound not to palaces or battlefields, but to roadside stations. The stations also served others. Merchants traveling along the road often stopped to rest, exchanging gossip and goods. Officials on inspection tours lodged there, carrying the king's authority into distant provinces. Even ordinary travelers, if permitted, found shelter within their walls. Thus the stations became hubs of information. Stories of rebellion in Egypt, famine in Lydia, or new taxes in Babylon might travel faster by gossip, in inns and by the king's couriers. For those who paused to listen, the hum of conversation at a roadside post could reveal as much as any official tablet. But the stations were not only places of rest. They were also places of control. Each keeper reported not only on the couriers, but also on travelers. Who passed, when, and with what goods. Suspicious figures might be noted, and reports sent onward. In this way, the road became not only a highway of communication, but also a web of surveillance. For the king, this was invaluable. To control an empire, you must know who moves within it. The stations provided eyes and ears across thousands of miles. Imagine for a moment a single day at a roadside post near Susa. At dawn, workers feed the horses, clean the stalls, and prepare grain. By midday, the heat shimmers, and a courier arrives from the east. Dust clings to his hair, his tunic dark with sweat. He barely pauses before exchanging mounts and riding westward. The stable boys laugh quietly at his grim determination. But once he vanishes, their laughter fades into more work. Another horse to water, another stall to clean. The cook prepares lentils and bread for the evening meal. At night, travelers gather in the common room, their voices low, A merchant boasts of profits in Sardis. A soldier mutters about restlessness in Egypt. The station keeper listens, making mental notes. Tomorrow, another courier will come, and the cycle will begin again. It is dull, it is repetitive, and it is the very heartbeat of empire. For you, listening now, it may seem strange to linger on such ordinary details, but history is not only the story of kings and battles. It is also the story of roadside workers who never left their posts, who lived their whole lives within sight of the road, and whose labor made imperial grandeur possible. The first post offices were not marble halls, but mud brick stations. Their clerks did not sell stamps, but checked seals. Their clients were not citizens sending letters, but couriers racing with decrees. And yet, in these quiet stations lay hidden tensions. What happened when horses were not ready? When workers grew resentful of endless toil? When rumors overheard and spread faster than official decrees? The stations, meant to guarantee order, could just as easily become cracks in the empire's surface. If the strength of an empire depends not only on kings and couriers, but also on the nameless workers at roadside posts, what happens when those workers falter or when their loyalty begins to fray? The roadside stations of Persia were more than pit stops for tired couriers. They were the quiet cogs of empire, places where information was logged, travelers watched, and supplies carefully tallied. To see them only as stables would be to miss their larger purpose. They were, in truth, the empire's first network of administrative outposts. At the center of each station stood the station keeper, often an official of modest rank. His duty was not glamorous, but was heavy with responsibility. He kept logs of every courier who passed, noting the seal on each message, the time of arrival, and the condition of the horse. Clay or wax tablets filled with these records piled up in storerooms, later bundled and carried to larger archives in Susa or Persepolis. These small notations, dull as they might seem, created a continuous chain of accountability stretching across the empire. If a message was delayed, the king's officials could trace its progress. Passed here at dawn, there at nightfall, handed over again the next morning. Each station's log was a small but vital brick in the wall of imperial order. The couriers were the most visible, but they were not the only concern. Station keepers also recorded the passage of other travelers, merchants bringing goods from Lydia, envoys from Egypt, soldiers marching toward Babylon, even wandering pilgrims and peddlers. All were subject to the station's quiet scrutiny. In this way, the stations became nodes of surveillance. They allowed the empire not only to move messages, but also to monitor movement. A suspicious caravan, a wandering mercenary, a group of foreigners, all could be noted, reported, and eventually investigated. For the king, these reports were invaluable. They gave him eyes on roads he could never travel himself. But the stations were not only about order, they were also about community. In the evenings, when the last courier had ridden westward and the horses were settled, travelers gathered in the common rooms. Merchants traded gossip along with goods. Officials grumbled about taxes. Soldiers bragged of battles. The air was thick with smoke from oil lamps, the smell of bread, and the murmur of languages from across the empire. It was here in these modest halls that the true news network of Persia thrived. Rumors often traveled faster than couriers. A tax increase announced in Susa might be whispered in Sardis before the official decree arrived. A rebellion in Egypt might be exaggerated into a full collapse by the time it reached Babylon. The stations meant to spread order also spread uncertainty. Behind the station keepers' records and the gossip of merchants lay the work of those who rarely received acknowledgement. Stable hands who hauled water by the bucket, often from wells miles away. Cooks who prepared meals not just for workers, but for passing officials. Guards who patrolled the perimeter against thieves or bandits. Their lives were consumed by repetition. Feed the horses, patch the roofs, sweep the courtyards, record the hour of a courier's arrival. Day after day, year after year, their work blurred into routine. Yet without them, the couriers could not ride, the messages could not move, the empire could not breathe. Of course, no system ran perfectly. Horses were sometimes unavailable, grain stores spoiled, Station keepers grew lazy or worse, corrupt. A bribe might earn a merchant faster service, or allow a courier to rest longer than regulations permitted. For travelers, these failures could mean danger. A delayed courier could mean delayed reinforcements. A spoiled batch of fodder could leave horses weakened. Small failures at small stations sometimes swelled into large consequences across the empire. And for workers bound to the system, resentment was common. Endless toil, low rations, little recognition. The empire demanded loyalty, but loyalty is fragile when it is built on monotony and burden. For you, listening now, it is worth pausing to imagine the human texture of these stations. Not the grandeur of palaces, but the dust of courtyards. Not the roar of armies, but the snort of horses in the night. Not the triumph of kings, but the grumbling of stable boys. These stations, boring as they might seem, were the foundation of imperial stability. Every wax-sealed tablet, every courier's gallop, every log entry depended on them. They were small, but they were everywhere. By building this network, the Persian kings achieved something extraordinary, a state that could act across thousands of miles with a speed no other ancient empire could match. But they also created dependence. If a single station failed, the chain was weakened. If corruption spread, the road itself faltered. If local workers lost faith in the system, messages slowed, and the illusion of omnipresent power faded. Thus the stations were both the empire's strength and its vulnerability. If the empire's greatness rested on the hidden labor of roadside workers, what happened when those workers, weary and overlooked, decided that their burden was no longer worth carrying? The roadside stations of the Persian Empire were built to last, but nothing in history is immune to change. What began as a marvel of organization eventually became strained, corrupted, and finally transformed under new rulers. Their story, like the empire itself, is one of rise, endurance, and decline, but also of legacy. For decades, the system worked with near mechanical precision. Horses were ready, records kept, couriers exchanged with seamless rhythm. But as the empire aged, so too did its infrastructure. Station keepers who once carried their duties with vigilance grew complacent. Horses were neglected, their feed diminished by corruption or simple shortage. Records grew sloppier, gossip more dangerous. It was not a sudden collapse, but a slow erosion, the kind that eats away at trust long before walls fall. When Alexander of Macedon stormed through Persia in the 4th century BCE, the road network was still in place, but its guardians could not withstand the upheaval of war. Many stations were abandoned or destroyed. Some were seized and repurposed by Alexander's armies, turned into waypoints for his own couriers. What had once carried the commands of Darius now carried orders from his conqueror. It is telling that Alexander recognized the value of the stations immediately. He did not dismantle them. He used them. He understood, as the Persians had, that an empire cannot live by swords alone. It must live by roads, stations, and the steady flow of information. Centuries later, Rome carried forward what Persia had begun. The Roman cursus publicus, their official postal system, bore an uncanny resemblance to the Persian network. Relay stations stocked with horses, inns where travelers rested, bureaucrats logging arrivals and departures. The Romans may have perfected it, extending stone-paved roads and placing milestones across their provinces, but the seed had been planted in Persia. In this way, the boring stations of Anatolia and Mesopotamia lived on in the heart of Europe. What Rome built, it built partly on Persian precedent. Even after Rome fractured, the model endured. The Byzantines inherited and adapted the cursus publicus. The Abbasids, ruling from Baghdad, created their own postal system, the Barid, with stations and surveillance strikingly similar to Persian methods. Across centuries and continents, the pattern repeated. If you wish to rule widely, you must build not only roads with stations along them, staffed by unseen workers who kept the lifeblood of information flowing. And yet, the lives of those workers remain shadows. We have tablets listing fodder for horses, wages for stable hands, rations for cooks, but their voices are gone. No one recorded their complaints, their laughter, their weariness. All that remains are traces, a log of barley given to a stable boy, a tally of sheep consumed at a station feast, a scribbled note of repairs to a leaking roof. History remembers kings and conquerors, but the empire's pulse was kept alive by men and women who never left their stations, whose world was bounded by the sound of hooves and the repetition of tasks. The decline of the stations revealed a larger truth. Empires are fragile not only when armies falter, but when their invisible systems fail. A station without horses meant a courier delayed. A delay meant a satrap uninformed. An uninformed satrap meant a rebellion left grow unchecked. The stations showed how greatness rests not on the spectacular, but on the ordinary. Lose the ordinary, and the spectacular collapses soon after. For you listening now, there is something strangely modern in this story. The next time you receive a package at your door or a message in seconds across the world, imagine the Persian station by the roadside. Imagine the weary groom, the dusty courtyard, the log scratched onto a tablet. The convenience you take for granted is the descendant of their toil. The world you inhabit rests on the same principle, that information must move and that it depends on networks of places, people, and systems most of us never see. Even today, our post offices, delivery hubs, and data centers echo Persia stations. They may hum with electricity rather than horses, but they are just as hidden, just as essential, just as boring in their details, and just as powerful in their consequences. The idea of a relay lives on an internet servers, satellite networks, and cloud storage. Your messages fly not across deserts, but through cables and signals. Yet the principle remains unchanged. A chain of stations, each handing the message to the next. The Persians would not understand technology, but they would understand the concept. The roadside posts of the Persian Empire no longer stand. Their mud walls crumbled centuries ago. Their courtyard silent, their logs lost to fire and decay. Yet their ghost lingers in every system of communication that followed. They remind us that empires are not sustained by glory alone, but by ordinary places where ordinary people do ordinary tasks with relentless regularity. It may seem dull to speak of roadhouses and fodder, of logs and seals, of barley rations and stable boys. Yet it is in these very dull details that history's greatest empires found their strength. So let this story end with a question to carry forward. If the strength of Persia once rested on the unnoticed work of its stations, how much of our own world rests on systems we never think about until the day they fail? When we speak of empires, we often speak of stone, palaces, monuments, walls. But the Persian Empire rested as much on muscle as on masonry. The speed of its communication depended not only on the ingenuity of roads and the discipline of couriers, but on the living bodies of animals and men. Without their endurance, the royal road would have been nothing more than a strip of dust. This story begins not in a palace, but in a stable. The horse was the courier's lifeline. Unlike soldiers' mounts, trained for battle and glory, the postal horses were bred for stamina and speed. Leaner, lighter. Their value lay not in charging enemies, but in carrying men and messages across endless miles. Each station along the royal road kept a stock of these animals, rotated carefully to prevent exhaustion. Some records suggest that horses might be used only once in a day's relay before being rested, fed, and watered. The empire could afford this, for its wealth was vast, and because it understood that the road was only as strong as the horses beneath its riders. Imagine the sound. Hooves pounding the packed earth, the rhythm steady and relentless. For a courier, the bond with his mount was fleeting. He might ride it for only a few miles before trading it for another. Yet in those miles, his life and the empire's stability depended on the animal's strength. Horses were fast, but camels had their place too. In the harsher stretches of the empire, where deserts stretched out like seas of dust, camels carried loads too heavy or conditions too harsh for horses. They were slower, yes, but their endurance was unmatched. They could survive where horses faltered, carrying supplies, water, and sometimes even messages when the terrain demanded. To see a caravan of camels moving slowly across the desert was to glimpse another layer of the empire's logistics. The slower but steady backbone that supported the swift horse relays. The Persians, pragmatic as ever, did not rely on one animal alone. They mixed speed and endurance, choosing horses where roads allowed, camels where deserts demanded. And then there were the men, not the couriers alone, but the grooms, the stable boys, the herdsmen who raised and trained the animals. Their lives were consumed by care. They rose before dawn to feed and water, to brush coats and check hooves, to mend tack and harness. When couriers arrived, they rushed forward, exchanging one horse for another in a practice dance. Most of these men were nameless in the records. They appear only in fragments, a ration tablet here, a tally of fodder there. Yet without them, the horses would weaken, the camels falter, and the system grind to a halt. The empire's speed was built not only on the backs of animals, but on the endless labor of men whose names history never cared to record. Feeding the animals was itself a colossal task. Horses required grain, barley or oats, as well as grass and water. Camels required fodder and steady access to wells. To supply this network, the Persians built storage depots along the road, stocking grain in advance. Local farmers often bore the burden, their harvests redirected to sustain the empire's couriers. For some, this was a steady source of income. For others, a burden resented in silence. It was not glamorous, but it was essential. Without fodder, there was no road. Without grain, there was no speed. The couriers themselves endured as much as their mounts, riding for hours at a stretch, exposed to blazing heat or chilling winds. They lived in a rhythm of urgency. Their duty was to ride hard, dismount, pass the tablet, mount again, and vanish. Sleep was rare, meals snatched in moments, conversation almost non-existent. Their lives were consumed by motion, their bodies worn by constant strain. And yet, their anonymity was complete. No monuments bear their names. No histories tell their stories. They lived and died in service to speed, as interchangeable as the horses they rode. For you, listening now, the story may seem to sag under the weight of dullness. Horses fed, camels watered, men laboring in dust. But here's the paradox. These boring details mattered more to the empire's survival than its golden palaces. The Persians could not have ruled millions without the steady rhythm of animal care, the endless repetition of feeding, watering, and riding. The empire's greatness was sustained by ordinary hooves and hands. But strain was inevitable. Horses died under pressure. Camels grew thin when wells ran dry. Men grew weary of endless labor. The system demanded perfection, but perfection was impossible. Each failure, a dead horse, a stolen camel, a courier collapsing from exhaustion, rippled outward. A message delayed by hours could change the fate of provinces. The empire lived on speed, but speed carried its own fragility. If the lifeblood of Persia's power rested on animals and men, what happens when bodies, unlike stone, finally give out? The Persian courier system was not simply about men and animals racing across the desert. It was about preparation, the endless, monotonous preparation that made those bursts of speed possible. Behind every galloping horse and every urgent courier lay an invisible network of farmers, storehouses, and supply lines. To understand the empire's logistics is to see how boredom, repeated endlessly, became the scaffolding of power. A single horse required vast amounts of food, barley or oats for strength, hay or grass for bulk, and constant access to water. Multiply that by the thousands of horses stationed along the royal road, and you glimpse the true cost of speed. The empire did not simply trust chance. Storehouses were built along the road, stocked with grain gathered from nearby villages. Farmers were required to contribute part of their harvest to the system, either as tax or as mandated supply. For some villages, this was opportunity, a steady market for their crops. For others, it was burden, a demand that drained resources and tied their labor to the needs of couriers they might never see. Either way, the horses ate first. Empire demanded it. Camels, though less numerous, posed their own challenges. They could endure heat and distance, but they still required fodder and, above all, water. Wells were dug, sometimes deep to supply them. Station keepers became not only stable masters, but water managers. A dry well could cripple the chain of couriers in an entire region. And so, the empire's reach was often defined by where water could be reliably secured. It was not armies that limited Persia's expansion, but sometimes wells. The humble need for water drew invisible boundaries on the map of empire. Most of the empire subject had little say in its glory, but they felt its weight in their fields. A farmer in Lydia might wake each season knowing that a portion of his barley would not feed his family, but would vanish down the throats of unseen horses along a road he might never travel. This contribution was not glamorous. It was not celebrated in inscriptions or immortalized in art. Yet without it, the couriers could not ride. The empire's speed rested on furrows of land plowed by men whose names never reached history scrolls. Grain once collected had to be stored. Clay jars, sealed and marked, lined warehouses near major stations. Smaller caches were hidden in rural outposts, ensuring that even remote stretches of road could feed horses and men. These storage depots were vulnerable. Rodents, moisture, or careless guards could spoil supplies. Bandits could raid them, depriving couriers of food and forcing delays. Station keepers bore heavy responsibility, for a single ruined storehouse could cripple communications in their region. Once again, the dull details, jars, lids, seals, inventories, determined whether the empire's arteries flowed smoothly or clogged with delay. Behind every relay was not just a courier, but a chain of laborers. Farmers growing grain, tax collectors demanding quotas, porters hauling sacks, scribes recording tallies, guards defending depots, stable boys feeding animals. Each link seemed small, but together they created the invisible machine of empire. If even one link broke, the system faltered. A dishonest tax collector withholding grain, a lazy porter spilling a sack, a scribe miscounting. Each error rippled outward until it slowed the couriers themselves. The royal road's speed was never truly about horses. It was about the human chain that fed them. It is easy to admire the Persian system from afar, to marvel at its efficiency. But for those who lived under it, speed was costly. Farmers labored longer to meet quotas. Families gave up grain they might have eaten. Workers bent their lives around the needs of animals they did not own. And for what? For messages they could not read. For kings they would never meet. The empire's grandeur was bought with their monotony, their sacrifice, their silence. For you, listening now, there is something revealing here. The royal road was not only a triumph of engineering, but a triumph of logistics. It was the first lesson in empire that glory depends on boredom, that monuments depend on mundane details, that kings depend on farmers. When you picture Persia's couriers flying across the road, remember also the bent backs in the fields, the jars sealed in warehouses, the nameless workers hauling water. Their lives were uncelebrated, but their labor made speed possible. But monotony and burden breed resentment. In times of prosperity, farmers endured the quotas. In times of hardship, drought, flood, or famine, the demands became intolerable. When revolts flared in the empire, they were not always about kings or generals. Often, they were about taxes, quotas, and the unending siphoning of resources. The royal road, symbol of unity, could also symbolize oppression. For those who fed the horses, speed was not marvel but burden. If the empire's glory rested on the silent sacrifices of its people, how long could that glory endure before silence turned into defiance? The glory of the Persian communication system rested on horses, camels, and the men who cared for them. Yet no system built on bodies alone could endure unchanged forever. Flesh grows weary, resources stretch thin, and even the most disciplined networks crumble when their foundations weaken. This is the story of how Persia's living engines began to fail, and how their hoofbeats echoed in later empires. At the height of the Achaemenid Empire, the rhythm of couriers seemed unstoppable. Horses rotated daily, camels carried supplies, couriers endured mile after mile, but strain was constant. Horses collapsed from overuse. Records speak of rations adjusted because animals had weakened. In desperate times, couriers rode beyond their intended range, pushing mounts until they died along the roadside. Camels, though hardier, suffered too. Wells dried, fodder dwindled, and long marches across the desert left carcasses behind as grim reminders of overextension. The men were no different. Couriers endured long stretches without rest. Grooms bent their lives to endless feeding and cleaning. Farmers gave harvests until their own families went hungry. The empire demanded speed, but speed was paid for in sweat, exhaustion, and silent sacrifice. The system was resilient, but not invincible. A missed delivery of grain meant underfed horses. An underfed horse meant a slowed courier. A slowed courier meant a delayed command. A delayed command could mean rebellion spreading before soldiers arrived. Thus, the fragility of the Empire's logistics was revealed, not in sudden collapse, but in small, compounded failures. What seemed a marvel from afar was always precarious up close. When Alexander's forces marched into Persia, they did not dismantle the courier system. They simply redirected it. The stations, the horses, the grooms, all became his tools. But by then, the system was already strained. Wars on multiple fronts had drained resources. Horses were fewer, fodder scarcer. The efficiency that once dazzled outsiders now faltered under the weight of neglect. Alexander's conquest exposed the truth. When an empire builds its lifeblood on bodies, its strength lasts only as long as those bodies can endure. And yet, Persia's model did not vanish. Rome adopted and refined it. The cursus publicus, Rome's state courier system, relied on horses and men just as Persia's had. But Rome built more permanent infrastructure. Paved roads, milestones, detailed laws regulating the system. Still, the core was the same. Horses, fodder, inns, couriers. The difference lay not in the principle, but in the scale and the durability of Rome's stone-paved arteries. Persia had shown the world the possibility. Rome carried it further. The Byzantines continued the pattern, adapting both Persian and Roman systems. The Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad built the Berid, a network of couriers and stations strikingly similar to Persia's. Even into medieval Europe, kings relied on mounted messengers, inns, and quotas of fodder. The animals changed, the roads changed, but the principle remained. Speed required flesh, and flesh required endless care. Looking back, it becomes clear that the Persian system's brilliance was also its weakness. It achieved speed without technology beyond hoof and hand. But that same dependence meant it could not scale infinitely, nor could it endure unchecked strain. It was fragile, vulnerable to drought, disease, corruption, and simple human fatigue. It was not palaces or armies that determined its fate, but grain, water, and horses. For you, listening now, there is something humbling here. Our modern systems, planes, trucks, fiber optic cables, seem more advanced, but they too rest on fragile chains. Fuel, electricity, labor, logistics. We too live on networks that seem unstoppable until they break. The Persians remind us that speed is never free. It is purchased at a cost, whether in fodder, wages, or the exhaustion of those who carry the burden. The story of Persia's horses, camels, and men is not one of glory, but of endurance. Their names are forgotten, their bodies long gone, but their labor carried the words of kings, bound provinces to palaces, and stitched together an empire. And yet, the echo of their hoofbeats lingers in every system of speed since. From Rome's relays to medieval posts, from steam trains to data centers, each system faces the same truth. That speed is powerful but fragile, and always dependent on the bodies, human or otherwise, that sustain it. If the strength of Persia rested on the weariness of animals and men, what fragile foundations carry the speed of our own world today? And how long will they endure before history demands their replacement? When we speak of the Persian courier system, we picture the great royal road stretching like a vein across the empire. But not all roads were open to sight. Beneath the public routes lay hidden ones, known only to official soldiers and trusted couriers. They were less celebrated, less visible, and often deliberately concealed. And yet, it was these secret arteries that allowed the king to move knowledge where ordinary travelers could not. An empire that spanned from the Aegean to the Indus faced more than the challenge of distance. It faced the danger of betrayal. If every message moved along the same road, enemies and rebels would know where to intercept them. If every traveler could guess the courier's paths, secrecy would vanish. Thus, alongside the main royal road, alternative paths existed. Smaller tracks through valleys, guarded passes through mountains, and desert trails known only to select riders. These were not marked with milestones or public ends. They were maintained quietly, away from the eyes of ordinary subjects. The hidden routes were not for merchants or pilgrims. They were for messages too delicate to risk on public paths. Orders about troop movements, news of rebellion, reports from spies. To carry such messages required not only speed but invisibility. Couriers on these hidden tracks were fewer, their journeys lonelier, their risks greater. Unlike the bustling royal road with its steady rhythm of stations, the hidden paths often relied on improvised shelters, wells known only to locals, or secret caches of supplies. These couriers were not anonymous riders among many. They were trusted men, chosen for loyalty as much as stamina. A single betrayal could cost provinces. Consider Anatolia. While the main road stretched from Sardis to Susa, side routes wound through valleys and forests. Some led to garrisons hidden in the hills, others to passes that allowed couriers to bypass dangerous stretches. Or think of the deserts east of Susa. Alongside the main caravan paths lay trails that hugged oases or wound between dunes. Only those trained in their geography could ride them without losing their way. In mountainous regions, secret passes offered shortcuts, dangerous but swift. A rider who knew them could shave days off a journey, or vanish entirely from the sight of enemies. The map of Persia was not a single road, but a web of visible and invisible threads. The men who rode these hidden routes lived in a different rhythm than their counterparts on the royal road. They could not rely on regular stations with fresh horses always waiting. Instead, they rode longer stretches on fewer mounts. They carried their own food and water. They paused at unmarked shelters, often guarded by soldiers or locals sworn to secrecy. Their missions were not logged as openly. Their seals might carry special marks, known only to the court. To outsiders, they seemed ordinary riders, but within their pouches lay messages whose weight could determine war or peace. To be such a courier was both honor and burden. Trust was heavy, and the road was lonely. At first, it might seem inefficient to maintain secret routes. Why not simply strengthen the royal road? The answer lies in control. Public roads could be observed, attacked, or corrupted. Hidden ones gave the king options. If rebels blocked the main road, couriers could slip along alternative paths. If foreign envoys watched one route, another carried the truth. Secrecy was not decoration. It was survival. The idea of hidden roads was not unique to Persia. Rome, too, maintained restricted routes for military messengers. The Byzantines guarded mountain passes with secret garrisons. Even medieval kings had private post systems alongside public ones. But Persia may have been the first to weave secrecy so deliberately into its communications. For you, listening now, it may feel strange to imagine roads that no map recorded, paths that ordinary Persians never walked. Yet, these were the threads that gave the empire resilience. The royal road dazzled the Greeks. The hidden roads, unseen, protected the Persians. But secrecy carries its own dangers. If a hidden path is known only to a few, what happens when those few are lost? If trust rests on silence, what happens when silence is broken? If the strength of Persia's empire lay partly in hidden roads, did those roads protect it from danger, or did their secrecy create vulnerabilities of their own? The hidden roads of Persia were not accidents of geography. They were deliberate constructions, maintained by the same logic that built the royal road, but with an added layer of secrecy and control. To understand them is to glimpse the shadowy side of communication, where couriers became more than messengers and stations became outposts of surveillance. Unlike the public royal road, which fell under the broad authority of satraps and their officials, the hidden routes were overseen directly by the king's court. The king's eye, royal inspectors who traveled unannounced across the empire, often used these secret paths. Their reports bypassed satrapal officials, reaching the throne without interference. This was crucial, for it prevented governors from concealing corruption or rebellion. Control of the hidden roads, then, was not decentralized. It was tight, personal, and bound directly to the throne. Few knew their full extent, and fewer still dared to interfere with them. Maintaining these routes required subtlety. Unlike the Great Royal Road, lined with visible stations, the hidden roads often relied on smaller, unmarked shelters. A mud brick hut here, a guarded cave there, a shaded grove near a stream. Supplies were stored discreetly. Jars of grain buried beneath sand, water skins hidden in rock crevices, fodder kept in sealed pits. These caches were refreshed by locals, farmers, herdsmen, or villagers bound to service. But unlike public road workers, they operated quietly, knowing that their labor was for the king's eyes only. For them, secrecy was survival. To speak openly of the hidden routes was to invite suspicion, or worse, punishment. Couriers on the hidden roads carried more than tablets. They were often tasked with gathering information as they rode. Stopping at small villages, they noted unusual movements. Caravans too large to be ordinary trade, soldiers drilling without orders, whispers of unrest. They carried these observations alongside sealed tablets, their words forming an intelligence network woven into the very act of communication. This blurred the line between courier and spy. Each hidden road messenger was not only a runner of words, but a watcher of men. The Persians understood that speed was only half the battle. Information mattered as much as its delivery. Through hidden routes, reports from informants could reach the throne quickly, without passing through satrapal officials who might suppress them. These messages might concern suspected treason, plots against governors, or the loyalty of military commanders. The secrecy of the roads ensured that such intelligence arrived unaltered, invisible to those who might wish to intercept it. It is no coincidence that Greek sources often describe the Persian king as all-seeing, his eyes and ears everywhere. The hidden roads were the arteries of that surveillance, but secrecy carried costs. Couriers chosen for these roads bore immense responsibility. Unlike the public system, where riders were interchangeable, hidden road couriers were hand-picked for loyalty. They might be Persians of noble families, or men whose families were effectively hostages of the crown. Their reliability had to be absolute, for a single betrayal could expose an entire network. For the riders, the burden was heavy. They carried not only the king's seal, but also his trust, and the knowledge that failure could mean disgrace or death. For you listening now, these hidden roads might feel like something out of a spy tale, but they were not glamorous. They were dusty tracks, lonely wells, half-ruined shelters. What made them powerful was not their appearance, but their invisibility. The royal road dazzled outsiders with its grandeur. The hidden roads whispered with secrets, invisible to all but those who served the throne. And yet, secrecy can become weakness. If only a handful of men know the paths, what happens when those men are lost in war? If a courier betrays his oath, how quickly can hidden roads become enemy assets? If secrecy hides corruption as well as protecting truth, can the throne ever be certain it sees clearly? If hidden roads made the king powerful by bypassing his officials, do they also make him vulnerable? Too dependent on a few secretive channels, too blind to what lay outside their reach? The hidden roads of Persia were built for secrecy, but like all systems, they carried within them the seeds of fragility. What was once an invisible strength eventually faded into vulnerability, and then into memory. Their story is less about collapse in a single moment than about slow erosion and adaptation. The hidden roads were most effective when Persia's empire was strong, its wealth abundant, and its central authority firm. Under Darius I and his successors, the system hummed with purpose. Couriers moved swiftly, inspectors traveled unnoticed, secrets flowed to the throne. But as the empire stretched thinner, secrecy became harder to maintain. Wars on multiple fronts drained resources. Corruption crept into the ranks of satraps. Even the king's eye, traveling incognito, could not always pierce through the layers of deception. And so the hidden routes, once sharp tools of control, began to dull. Horses were fewer. Supplies dwindled. Trust, that most fragile resource, weakened. The very thing that made the hidden roads effective also made them dangerous. Because they were secret, their function depended on very few individuals. If those individuals betrayed the system or failed in their duties, the king could be blinded. A satrap could intercept a hidden courier and silence him, leaving the throne ignorant of unrest. A rebel could discover a secret trail and turn it into an ambush. The more secret the road, the fewer eyes protected it. Secrecy, it turned out, was both shield and shadow, protecting the empire at times, obscuring it at others. When Alexander swept into Persia, he made immediate use of the royal road. The hidden routes, however, were more difficult. Some he captured by bribery, learning of them from locals or disloyal officials. Others were simply abandoned, their secrecy too fragile to survive upheaval. Alexander did not need them. His conquest moved not by secrecy, but by overwhelming force. But their disappearance revealed the truth. Hidden systems are strong only while the state that guards them remains intact. Once the shield of the empire fell, the secret paths crumble with it. The idea, however, did not vanish. Rome's cursus publicus maintained certain restricted routes for official messengers, away from the eyes of ordinary travelers. The Byzantines, inheriting both Roman and Persian traditions, maintained secure passes for imperial couriers. The Abbasid bear wove secrecy into its postal system, creating networks of spies and hidden stations. Persia's hidden roads had planted a seed. Rulers learned that information must sometimes travel unseen, outside the channels of ordinary bureaucracy. From medieval kings' private couriers to modern intelligence networks, the logic persists. The story of Persia's secret routes is not about grand engineering projects or monuments. It is about the quieter truth that empires survive not only by what is visible, but also by what is concealed. But secrecy is a paradox. It strengthens rulers, giving them eyes where others see nothing. Yet it also weakens them, isolating them from the wider flow of information, making them dependent on fragile channels. For Persia, the hidden roads worked as long as loyalty held. Once loyalty cracked, secrecy became vulnerability. For you, listening now, there is something almost modern in this tale. Even today, governments and institutions maintain hidden roads of information, channels closed to the public, known only to a few. They offer protection, but they also risk distortion. The Persians remind us that secrecy is never neutral. It is both strength and fragility, shield and blindfold. The hidden roads of Persia are gone now, their paths lost beneath soil, their shelters collapsed, their wells forgotten. Yet their logic endures in every system that values secrecy. From diplomatic cables to encrypted messages, from classified files to covert networks. The Persians understood that some truths must travel unseen. But they also discovered that when too much depends on secrecy, power itself becomes fragile. If the hidden roads once protected Persia's kings, how many of our own hidden networks today guard us? And how many conceal dangers we cannot yet see? If the royal road was the artery of Persia, and the couriers its pulse, then the king's eye was its vision. The Persian Empire did not survive merely on speed, nor on horses, nor even on wax-sealed tablets. It survived because its rulers understood something deeper. Power rests on information. And so they created a system of inspectors and observers, men who became known to the Greeks as the king's eye and the king's ear. They traveled the empire quietly, watching, listening, reporting directly to the throne. They made the king's presence felt in places his body could never reach. The Achaemenid kings ruled a territory so vast that no single man could oversee it. From Egypt's deserts to the Indus Valley, satraps governed provinces on the king's behalf. But delegation breeds danger. A satrap could grow too powerful, too independent, too slow to obey. To prevent this, the kings created inspectors. These men move across provinces with authority higher than any governor. They could appear unannounced, demand records, interrogate officials, and carry their findings straight back to Susa or Persepolis. The Greeks, who marveled at the system, gave them their name, the King's Eye. Picture an inspector on the move. He travels with a small escort, his authority carried not by armies but by a sealed commission. He might arrive at a satrap's palace at dawn, demanding access to ledgers of tax collection. He might walk uninvited through storehouses, checking grain tallies against quotas. Officials squirmed at his presence. Even if they had done no wrong, the sudden inspection exposed every inefficiency. For a satrap plotting rebellion, the inspector was terror itself, a reminder that the king's gaze was never far. The inspector made no public proclamations. He simply observed, recorded, and reported. His weapon was knowledge, and knowledge was power. The eye was more than a set of men. It was an idea. The belief that the king could see all, hear all, know all. Even when inspectors were not present, the possibility that they might appear kept officials in line. A satrap tempted to skim taxes hesitated. A commander tempted to slacken his drills reconsidered. The road might be long, but the king's eye was longer. This fear was as effective as soldiers. Perhaps more so, for it worked invisibly, shaping behavior without a sword being drawn. Alongside the eye was the ear. These were informants, sometimes officials, sometimes common men, who reported whispers of unrest, rumors of rebellion, the private grumblings of subjects. Their reports move along hidden roads, carried by couriers whose seals bypass satraps. Together, the eye and ear created a network that blurred the line between administration and espionage. The Persians understood that distance was their greatest enemy. Armies could march, yes, but rebellion spread faster than soldiers. To rule widely, the king needed information more than force. And so, they built a network where inspectors, couriers, and seals worked in harmony. A satrap's failure in Sardis could be known in Susa within days. A shortage of grain in Egypt could be reported before famine turned into revolt. Speed mattered, but accuracy mattered more. The king's eye ensured that the king saw what was truly happening, not just what governors wanted him to see. For you, listening now, there's something chilling in this system. Imagine living under it, knowing that at any moment, an inspector might walk into your town, peer into your accounts, listen to your words, and carry them far away. The empire's greatness depended on it, but so did its tension. People obeyed not only out of loyalty, but out of fear of being watched. And yet, surveillance carries risks. If the king trusted only his inspectors, what happened when inspectors themselves grew corrupt? If the eye was blinded, if the ear whispered falsehoods, could the king still see clearly? If information was the true lifeblood of Persia's empire, what happened when that information became distorted, or when those who carried it chose deception over truth? The image of the Persian king as omniscient was no illusion. It was a product of a system deliberately designed to pierce the fog of distance. Inspectors, spies, and informants worked in silence, but their influence rippled across the empire. Their reports could move armies, depose satraps, or redirect entire flows of wealth. To see this clearly, you must step into quiet rooms where knowledge was gathered, sealed, and sent. An inspector's power was absolute. Arriving unannounced, he could enter treasuries, demand ledgers, and summon officials. He did not need permission from satraps. His commission bore the authority of the throne itself. He checked tax records against quotas, grain tallies against storage jars, troop numbers against payroll lists. His questions were sharp, his presence unsettling. A satrap might smile, but his scribes trembled. Any discrepancy could be noted and carried directly to the king. Inspectors were not judges. They were witnesses. Their duty was to observe and report. Judgment came later, when the king decided whether to reprimand, replace, or punish. Yet inspections alone were not enough. They were periodic, predictable in their rhythm. To fill the gaps, the Persians relied on informants, the king's ear. These were not always official spies. Sometimes they were merchants, priests, or even servants who quietly passed along whispers of discontent. A satrap's banquet, a soldier's drunken boast, a villager's grumble about taxes, all could be carried back to Susa through hidden channels. Informants thrive in the empire's diversity. In a land of many languages and cultures, grumbling traveled quickly. The ear was trained to listen. Reports from inspectors and informants did not linger. They moved swiftly, sealed and carried by couriers along both public and hidden roads. The very system that carried decrees outward carried knowledge inward. This two-way flow was what made Persia unique. Communication was not only about commands from the throne, but about feedback from the provinces. In this sense, the empire was not simply ruled, it was monitored. The impact of these reports was immense. A satrap accused of withholding taxes might be summoned to Susa and stripped of office. A general suspected of disloyalty might find his command suddenly transferred. A city rumored to be restless might see soldiers arrive before rebellion took root. The king could act not only with speed but with foresight. He did not wait for rebellion to erupt. He acted on whispers before they grew into flames. This preemptive power was the true genius of the king's eye. But the system's strength was not only in what it reported. It was in what people believed it reported. Even when inspectors were not present, officials acted as if they might arrive. Even when no informant was in the room, men lowered their voices. uncertain who might be listening. The kings I worked not just by seeing, but by being believed to see. It was less about omniscience than about the illusion of omniscience. And yet, no system is perfect. Inspectors were men, and men could be bribed. Informants could lie, exaggerate, or misinterpret. If an inspector favored one faction, his reports might distort the truth. If an informant sought revenge, his whispers might condemn the innocent. The king, relying on these reports, risked being misled. The very system that gave him vision could also blind him. For you listening now, this story feels familiar. Even in the modern world, leaders rely on networks of advisors, spies, and reports. They depend on the accuracy of others, never able to see everything directly. Persia's kings remind us that power is not simply about issuing commands. It is about knowing where to issue them, when and why, and that knowledge rests on fragile channels, vulnerable to error, bias, and deceit. By the later Achaemenid period, cracks appeared. Some inspectors were compromised. Some reports contradicted others. The throne, overwhelmed by noise, struggled to separate truth from falsehood. And so the system that once kept Persia strong began to strain under its own complexity. Too many eyes, too many ears, too many whispers. If an empire's power rests on information, what happens when information itself becomes unreliable? When the king's eye is clouded and the ear hears only lies? The king's eye was the sharpest tool of the Persian throne. It saw what others could not. It heard what others dared not say. Yet, like all tools of power, it was not eternal. Its brilliance faded, its trust eroded, and its lessons passed on to other empires. At its peak, the system worked with unnerving efficiency. Inspectors arrived unannounced, informants whispered in hidden channels, and the king knew of problems before they became crises. It gave Persia an aura of omniscience, one that impressed even its enemies. But the larger the empire grew, the more difficult it became to maintain clarity. Reports multiplied, sometimes contradicting each other. An inspector claimed loyalty in one province, while an informant whispered of discontent. Which was true. The king was forced to choose between competing visions. The danger of such a system lay not only in deception, but in overload. Too much information can obscure truth as surely as too little. In time, corruption seeped in. Some inspectors took bribes to soften their reports. Some informants lied to eliminate rivals. A satrap accused unjustly might be punished, while another guilty of treason slipped away by silencing the right voices. The eye could see, but sometimes it was blinded by greed. The ear could hear, but sometimes it listened only to falsehoods. For the kings who trusted these networks, the danger was subtle but deadly. They believed they saw clearly when in truth they looked through a distorted lens. When Alexander invaded, he inherited not just Persia's roads, but also its culture of intelligence. His officers quickly realized that the Persian throne had eyes and ears everywhere. Some were turned with bribes, others silenced by conquest. The network, so effective under strong kings, could not withstand the shock of invasion. The fall of the king's eye revealed its weakness. It was only as strong as the empire that guarded it. Once the center collapsed, the network unraveled. Rome, like Alexander, understood the necessity of surveillance. Though they did not use the phrase king's eye, their governors and military commanders operated under a similar system of inspections and reports. Informers, the delators, whispered to the emperor. Provincial officials wrote detailed accounts of taxes and unrest. Rome perfected the bureaucracy of vision, but the logic was Persian in origin. The ruler must see beyond what his courtiers wished him to see. The Byzantines inherited the Roman model, refining it into a complex web of spies and inspectors. The Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad revived the practice under the Barid, where couriers doubled as intelligence officers. Even medieval kings across Europe used secret eyes, trusted agents who bypassed local lords to report directly to the crown. The Persian legacy lived on not in monuments of stone, but in the invisible architecture of surveillance. For you, listening now, the story may feel uncannily familiar. Even today, rulers and governments rely on eyes and ears, intelligence agencies, inspectors, auditors, informants. The tools are different, but the logic is the same. The Persian kings remind us of a timeless truth. Power rests not only on force but on knowledge. Yet knowledge is fragile. It can be twisted, corrupted, drowned in noise. The king's eye is long gone. Its inspectors lie forgotten. Their reports reduced to ash. Yet the idea endures, that to rule is to see, and to see is to rule. But vision can blur. Hearing can deceive. The very networks that strengthen a ruler can also isolate him, feeding him falsehoods wrapped in the seal of truth. So the story ends with a question that echoes far beyond Persia. If knowledge is power, what happens when those who hold power cannot tell the difference between truth and lies? The royal road is often described as a line on a map, but to truly understand it, you must imagine the experience of travel itself. To set out from Sardis, near the Aegean coast, and ride eastward toward the heart of Persia, was to pass through a world of shifting landscapes, languages, and lives. It was not only a road, but a corridor of empire, carrying you from one horizon to another. Our journey begins in Sardis, the old capital of Lydia, now a Persian satrapy. Once a kingdom of its own, Lydia had been folded into the empire, and its city became one of the great western anchors of the royal road. Here, the streets were lively with merchants trading in gold, textiles, and spices. Greek, Lydian, and Aramaic mingled in the air. The satrap's palace loomed above the city, but for travelers the road itself was the true monument. To leave Sardis was to step into the empire's bloodstream. The road ahead stretched east, paved in some sections with stone, in others packed hard with gravel and earth. Couriers and traders moved side by side, the dust rising in the morning light. Within a day's ride, the pattern became clear. Stations appeared at regular intervals, offering fresh horses and water. Some were modest, little more than courtyards and stables. Others bustled with merchants, guards, and travelers pausing for food and rest. The stations gave the road its rhythm. You measured your journey not in miles, but in stops, each one a small oasis of order before the next stretch of open land. For couriers, these stations were lifelines. For merchants, they were places of gossip, trade, and wary glances. And for locals, they were reminders that the empire's presence was never far away. The first great portion of the road wound through Anatolia. Here, hills rolled gently, forests shaded the way, and rivers cut across the path. Bridges of wood and stone spanned the waters, maintained by local labor under imperial command. Travelers passed through villages where farmers carried baskets of figs, where children watched the road with curiosity, where soldiers sometimes camped to guard the route. The empire was present in every step, not only in its officials, but in the daily obligations it demanded from ordinary people. The road was not lonely, but it was long. Even with fresh horses, the journey stretched over weeks. One of the striking features of the journey was a variety of people you encountered. In Sardis, Greek and Lydian. In Phrygia, a different tongue. Farther east, Aramaic became more common, with Old Persian in official inscriptions. The empire was a mosaic, and the road was its thread. Travelers shared little in common but the dust on their sandals and the coins in their purses. Yet the road tied them together, forcing encounter after encounter, creating a fragile unity out of diversity. For you, listening now, imagine yourself as one of these travelers. Days spent under sun and stars, nights at rough inns, mornings with the sound of hooves pounding the dirt. The road was not only physical, it was psychological. To walk or ride, it was to feel the empire's immensity. Each station reminded you of order. Each landscape reminded you of distance. As you pressed farther east, the land grew harsher. The Anatolian plateau stretched out, wind-swept and spare. Villages thinned. The distances between stations seemed longer. Horses tired more quickly. And yet, the road continued, maintained by unseen hands, its dust packed hard by centuries of feet and hooves. It was a marvel not because it dazzled the eye, but because it endured mile after mile. By the time you reached the midpoint of Anatolia, you had already passed through dozens of lives, dozens of languages, dozens of landscapes, and still Susa lay far ahead. The royal road revealed not just the empire's strength, but its fragility. A single broken bridge, a single abandoned station, a single dry well, and he could unravel the journey. If the royal road tied the empire together, did it truly unite its peoples? Or did it only expose how different, how distant, and how fragile that unity really was. The royal road was not a single landscape, but a chain of worlds. Having crossed Anatolia, the traveler now descended into the plains of Mesopotamia, where rivers shaped the land and cities pulsed with life. To walk or ride this stretch was to see the empire's diversity, revealed in stone, water, and dust. The descent from the Anatolian plateau brought new sights. The air grew heavier, the land greener, the rivers wider. Here, fields stretched outward in irrigation grids, sustained by canals that had fed civilizations for millennia. The road curved toward the Euphrates, its banks crowded with boats and traders. Crossing such a river was no small feat. Wooden bridges, reinforced with stone supports, spanned the waters, guarded by soldiers who checked travelers and collected tolls. For couriers, the crossings were swift. Horses hustled across, seals shown, no questions asked. For merchants, the delays could last hours, even days. The empire's road was efficient, but not equal. No city along the royal road loomed larger than Babylon. Though no longer an imperial capital, it remained a jewel of Mesopotamia, a city of towering walls, temples, and markets. Travelers arriving here were overwhelmed by its scale. Streets thronged with traders from across the empire, Egyptians selling grain, Phoenicians with purple cloth, Persians with wine and dates, Greeks haggling for spices. For couriers, Babylon was less a marvel than a checkpoint. Messages were exchanged, logged, and passed onward with precision. But for ordinary travelers, Babylon was a reminder of the empire's wealth and of the ancient powers Persia had absorbed into its fold. The road here was not only about movement, it was about presence. The clear assertion that Persia ruled the heart once claimed by Babylonian kings. Beyond Babylon lay more rivers, more bridges, more stations. The Tigris surged eastward, its waters swift and treacherous. Ferries supplemented bridges, carrying animals and carts when currents threatened. The road did not avoid these rivers. It embraced them, weaving across Mesopotamia's veins. Each crossing was a point of tension, easy for couriers, but harder for the farmers and merchants whose carts clogged the way. Yet this was Persia's genius, to integrate rivers, fields, and cities into one long corridor of motion. The road was not separate from the land. It was stitched into it. The stations of Mesopotamia bustled more than those of Anatolia. Here, inns grew into market centers. Merchants stopped not only to rest, but to sell wares. Soldiers stationed nearby brought demand for food, wine, and entertainment. At night, the stations glowed with lamplight, their courtyards filled with voices in a dozen tongues. Travelers shared bread, exchanged rumors, and sometimes argued over coin or customs. The road brought people together, but it also brought friction. Still, for weary travelers, these stations were relief. Food for the body, shelter for the night, and news for the mind. East of Mesopotamia, the land shifted again. The plains gave way to the Zagros Mountains, a formidable barrier before the Iranian plateau. Here, the road narrowed, twisting through valleys, climbing steep passes. Bridges gave way to carved paths, some no wider than a horse. Couriers pushed onward, but the pace slowed. Stations became sparser, water scarcer, and nights colder. For ordinary travelers, this was the hardest stretch. Bandits lurked in passes. Storms swept suddenly, and the road demanded both stamina and vigilance. Yet for the Empire, the Zagros were no obstacle. They were a test, one the Persians passed by sheer persistence. For you, listening now, the journey from Sardis to Susa reveals itself as more than distance. It was a living experience, one that shifted with each horizon. Hills, rivers, plains, mountains, each demanded adjustment. Each tested the Empire's will. To ride the road was to feel its immensity in your body. The ache of long days, the relief of stations, the weight of landscapes that never seemed to end. But as you climbed toward the Iranian plateau, a question lingered. The road united lands, yes. But did it truly knit their peoples together? In Babylon, Greeks traded with Persians but kept their tongues. In Anatolia, farmers served the road but resented its burdens. The royal road was efficient, but was it unifying, or was it only a thread stretched taut, always at risk of snapping under its own tension? If the royal road tied Sardis to Babylon and Babylon to Susa did create unity, or merely reveal how fragile that unity really was. The last stretch of the royal road was the most difficult, and perhaps the most symbolic. After passing to the plains of Mesopotamia and the rugged Zagros Mountains, travelers emerged onto the Iranian plateau. Here the landscape opened wide, dry and stark, but carried with it the unmistakable weight of arrival. For those who endured the journey, Susa was no longer a distant name, but a destination within reach. The Iranian plateau stretched vast and bare. The road cut across it like a line of determination, unwavering even as the wind whipped dust across its surface. Villages were fewer here, water scarcer, and stations farther apart. For couriers, this meant endurance. Horses pushed to their limits. Riders swayed with exhaustion, driven more by duty than strength. Yet the rhythm held. Station to station, seal to seal, the empire's heartbeat carried forward. For ordinary travelers, the plateau was a test of patience. Days blurred into one another, the horizon shifting little, the sun relentless. Yet there was a strange clarity in its emptiness, the sense that you were no longer in the margins of empire, but drawing closer to its core. As the plateau gave way to the valley of the Chosp River, the air shifted. Here, irrigation turned the land green again. Fields spread outward, dotted with villages that supplied grain and labor to the capital. And then, after weeks of dust, a city rose, Susa, one of the empire's great royal residences. Its walls stretched wide, its gates adorned with reliefs. Travelers who had trudged across thousands of miles now found themselves before a city, where the king's presence seemed tangible in stone and color. Susa was not the only Persian capital. Persepolis and Ecbatana also served as royal centers, but it was the administrative heart. From here, the courier's messages converged. From here, the king's decrees radiated outward again. For couriers arriving with sealed tablets, this was the end of their relay. Their duty complete, they handed messages to scribes, who carried them into palace archives. For merchants, it was a place to sell, to bargain, to seek favor. For common travelers, it was overwhelming. A city with scale of empire was no longer abstract, but visible in its palaces and bustling streets. To walk the entire royal road from Sardis to Susa was to experience the empire in miniature. Anatolia's hills, Mesopotamia's rivers, the Zagros Mountains, the Iranian plateau, all stitched together by one unbroken line of earth. It was a feat of endurance, not glamour. Dust on your clothes, blisters on your feet, sweat on your brow. And yet, the road itself was proof that the Persian Empire was more than a patchwork of lands. It was a system, an order, a rhythm carried in hooves and seals. For you, listening now, imagine reaching Susa after weeks of motion, the relief of arrival. Yes, but also the realization that the road you travel was less about destinations and more about connection. The royal road was not built to make life easier for travelers. It was built to keep the empire alive. To ride it was to feel the machinery of power beneath your feet, the constant hum of order hidden in dust and monotony. The road would outlast empires. Even when Persia fell to Alexander, even when Rome rose in the west, the idea of long, continuous highways with stations endured. The royal road's echoes can still be traced in Roman milestones, Byzantine courier networks, and even the post roads of medieval kings. What Persia created was not merely a road. It was a vision that speed and connection could bind a people, however diverse, into something greater than themselves. The royal road no longer stretches unbroken across Asia. Its stones and stations lie buried, its couriers long gone, but its legacy endures in every network of speed and communication that came after. And so this story ends with a reflection. If the royal road once united Sardis and Susa, west and east, distant lands and distant peoples, what are the roads of our own world today? And do they truly unite us, or only remind us how fragile connection can be? The Persian courier system was built on speed, but speed is nothing without trust. Each wax-sealed tablet that passed along the royal road carried the authority of the empire. A courier did not question its contents. A satrap did not delay its orders. The seal was everything. But where there is trust, there is also risk. For as long as the system endured, whispers spread of forged seals, counterfeit tablets, and altered messages. The royal road, designed to unite the empire, could also be turned into a weapon of deception. In Persia, the seal was sacred. A cylinder carved in stone, pressed into clay or wax, bore the mark of a king, a satrap, or an official. Once impressed, it became more than a decoration. It became law. A courier carrying such a seal rode with confidence. Guards stepped aside, station keepers obeyed, soldiers rallied. The seal was proof that the words within were not mere ink, but command. And yet, the very power of the seal made it tempting to copy. A counterfeit seal could unleash chaos. The tools were simple: clay, wax, and stone. A skilled craftsman could carve an imitation of a satrap cylinder. A conspirator could melt and reseal a tablet, altering its words before sending it onward. For most of the empire's history, these acts were rare. The penalties were severe and the risks immense. But the very existence of secrecy and hidden roads created opportunities for deceit. If a courier vanished, if a message was delayed, who could say whether the tablet that finally arrived was the original or a clever copy? Greek historians tell us of moments when forged orders nearly turned provinces against themselves. A satrap in one city might receive an urgent command to move troops, only to discover, days later, that no such order had been sent. A general might prepare for war, only to be contradicted by the next courier. We cannot know how often such incidents occurred. Records of forgery were rarely preserved, for no king wished to admit vulnerability. But the very fact that rumors spread suggests the risk was real. For couriers, forgery was a nightmare. They were not trained to read or question messages. Their duty was to deliver, not to doubt. If handed a forged tablet, they carried it faithfully, unaware of its danger. This blind trust was both the system's strength and its weakness. It ensured speed, but also left the empire vulnerable to deception. For you, listening now, there is a strange irony here. The empire's greatest strength, its reliance on seals and couriers, was also a doorway for its greatest weakness. A single forged seal could command soldiers, shift taxes, or sow rebellion. And yet, to distrust the seal was to unravel the entire system. By the later Achaemenid period, suspicion grew. Officials began to check seals more carefully, sometimes requiring multiple impressions from different authorities. Trust in the system faltered. What had once seemed absolute became fragile. If an empire rests on the authority of seals and couriers, what happens when people begin to doubt whether the seal is real or whether the courier carries truth or lies? The Persian Empire thrived on the assumption that a sealed message was truth. But history shows that whenever authority is concentrated in signs and symbols, there will be those who test their limits. Persia was no exception. The royal road, for all its speed, was also a stage for deception. The Greeks, fascinated by Persia's vast bureaucracy, often whisper about false orders. Herodotus tells us of times when satraps received contradictory commands, one urging restraint, another calling for action. Were these simply delays or evidence of counterfeit? We cannot know. What is clear is that rebellion sometimes spread faster than the king's truth. In such moments, forged messages may have played their part. A single tablet with false seal could send troops in the wrong direction, leave a city undefended, or sow confusion between allies. Even if rare, the fear of forgery lingered, and fear itself is corrosive. Persians were not naive. They introduced methods to guard against deception. Multiple seals, sensitive messages, sometimes bore more than one impression, from both the king and a trusted official. To copy one seal was difficult. To copy two was harder still. Unique impressions. Cylinder seals were carved with intricate designs, winged figures, animals, cuneiform inscriptions. No two were identical, and officials trained their eyes to spot fakes. Messenger verification. Couriers themselves were sometimes known to their recipients. An unfamiliar rider carrying a crucial message might be met with suspicion. These measures slowed forgery, but they could not erase the risk entirely. Every system built on trust carries its shadow. The true danger was not simply that forgeries existed. It was that doubt began to creep into the minds of officials. If a satrap received an order that seemed unusual, He might hesitate. Was the seal genuine? Was the message altered? That hesitation, even for hours, could mean disaster on the battlefield. Thus, the danger of forgery lay as much in suspicion as in reality. The road that once guaranteed swift obedience became a place of second-guessing. For those caught forging seals or altering tablets, the penalty was severe. Death was the usual outcome, often by cruel methods meant to deter others. Persian kings understood that forgery was not a small crime. It was treason, striking at the very heart of empire. To counterfeit a seal was to counterfeit authority itself. The punishment had to be absolute, but fear of punishment did not stop whispers. Even the possibility of forgery weakened the aura of certainty. For you, listening now, there is something strangely modern in this story. Even today, systems of communication rely on trust in symbols, signatures, stamps, passwords, digital certificates. When they are fake, chaos follows. The Persians remind us that this vulnerability is ancient. From clay and wax to electronic keys, trust has always been both the foundation and the flaw of human systems. By the late empire, contradictions in orders became more common. Was this due to forgery, or simply to bureaucratic confusion? Perhaps both. But the result was the same: hesitation, suspicion, fragility. The royal road still carried messages swiftly, but in the minds of those who received them, certainty was no longer guaranteed. If speed and authority rest on fragile trust, what happens when trust itself becomes the weakest link in the chain? The Persian Empire's brilliance lay not only in its armies or palaces, but in its communications. Yet the very tools that bound the empire together, wax-sealed tablets, cylinder impressions, loyal couriers, carry within them the seeds of doubt. In time, forgery and suspicion became as corrosive as rebellion. For most of its history, the royal road carried trust. A seal meant certainty. A courier meant authority. But as the empire aged, mistakes multiplied. Conflicting orders arrived in provinces. Couriers delayed by storms or raids delivered messages late, only for rebels to claim they had brought false commands. Were these truly forgeries? Or were they excuses, invented by satraps unwilling to obey? The answer may not matter. What mattered was that trust weakened. Once suspicion entered the system, hesitation followed. A satrap receiving orders might pause to verify them. A general, uncertain of his seal, might delay a march. In war, such hesitation could cost everything. There are hints that enemies of Persia learned to exploit this weakness. Rebels could spread rumors of false seals, undermining confidence even if no forgery occurred. Greek states, fighting Persia, may have forged orders to misdirect satrapal forces. The mere possibility of counterfeit was enough to weaken the empire's image of omniscience. If the king's seal could be doubted, then the king's authority itself could be doubted. Despite these vulnerabilities, Persia's system of seals endured in later empires. Rome adopted seals for official correspondence, though they also relied on signet rings worn by officials. Forgery remained a capital crime. Byzantium developed lead seals bully, attached to documents more difficult to fake, but still vulnerable. The Abbasid Caliphate revived Persia's courier and seal model in the Berid, blending communication with intelligence gathering. In every case, the problem remained the same. Seals inspired trust, but also invited forgery. The balance between speed, certainty, and suspicion remained fragile. Even in modern times, the principle persists. Handwritten signatures, passports, digital certificates, all function as seals, and all can be forged. The Persian struggle with counterfeiters is not a relic of antiquity, but a mirror of our own age. The Persians remind us that communication systems are never invulnerable. They depend not only on speed and structure, but on the fragile human agreement that a mark, a word, a symbol means truth. Break that agreement, and even the strongest empire falters. For you, listening now, the story may feel both distant and familiar. Distant, because it belongs to an empire long gone. Familiar, because the problem it faced, the corruption of trust, still shapes the systems you rely on today. Persia's wax and seals are gone, but their echo lingers in every password, every ID card, every stamp of authority you encounter. The couriers of Persia once rode with certainty, their seals unchallenged, their tablets unbroken. But over time, certainty gave way to doubt, and doubt gave way to fragility. The royal road remained. The horses galloped. The couriers rode. But the empire's greatest strength, its trust in communication, was also its greatest weakness. If every empire rests on trust in its symbols, how long can those symbols endure before suspicion erodes them? And who, then, decides what is truth? The royal road is remembered as a marvel of efficiency, a line of order stretched across the empire. But no road, however well maintained, is immune to disruption. Beneath the image of speed and certainty lay a quieter reality. Floods that washed out bridges, bandits who prowled the hills, storms that delayed riders. For every tale of flawless communication, there were days when the road failed. And in those failures, the empire's vulnerability was revealed. The road was guarded, yes, but Persia's empire was vast. Patrols could not be everywhere. In the mountains of Anatolia and the passes of Zagros, bandits found their chance. Couriers were prime targets. They carried no treasure, but their messages were priceless. To seize a courier was to seize the king's voice. Sometimes the bandits demanded ransom. Sometimes they destroyed the messages out of spite or rebellion. Merchants, too, feared the bandits. Caravans moved in groups for safety, their camels loaded with grain, cloth, or spices. Even then, ambushes struck. The road was fast, but it was never entirely safe.